Today, we're diving into the history of psychology, but we're not going to treat it like some dusty old textbook. Instead, we're going to explore it as this thrilling, non-stop series of passionate intellectual rebellions. Because honestly, every major leap forward in understanding ourselves didn't just quietly happen. It exploded as a direct revolt against whatever ideas came right before it. Okay, let's dive right into this. Here is the massive foundational question that's been keeping thinkers awake at night for centuries. What exactly is the human mind? And more importantly, how do you even study something that's totally invisible, entirely subjective, and impossible to physically touch? It's like a giant puzzle, and it's driven some of history's most brilliant people completely obsessed trying to solve it. Over the next few minutes, we're going to map out a quick journey through four distinct eras. We'll start with structuralism in the 1870s, flow right into functionalism in the 1890s, plunge deep into psychoanalysis in the early 1900s, and finally rise up to humanism in the 1950s. Section 1. Mapping the Mind, the Era of Structuralism. So back in the late 1800s, the very first experimental psychologists figured, hey, if we want to be taken seriously as a real science, we've got to treat the mind just like chemistry. And remember, this whole thing was born out of a deep frustration with all the fuzzy philosophy that came before it. Enter Edward Titchener, a student of the famous Wilhelm Wundt. Titchener created structuralism. His goal was, frankly, incredibly ambitious. He wanted to take the total sum of an adult's life experience and break it down into the absolute simplest, definable components. To pull this off, he used a highly rigid tool called introspection, which is essentially just intense, highly structured self-reporting. Look at how literal Titchener was about creating a chemistry of the mind. He literally chopped up all conscious experience into three distinct buckets: sensations, images, and affections. Then he'd make his subjects measure these elements using really strict properties, things like quality, intensity, and duration. He genuinely believed, absolutely to his core, that even the most complex, beautiful human thought was really just a cluster of basic sensations that you could isolate and catalog in a lab. And to keep things super scientific, Titchener enforced these bizarrely strict rules for his subjects. The most famous one? The stimulus error. Okay, imagine he hands you a pencil during an experiment. If you simply said, "Oh, I see a pencil," boom, you ruin the experiment. You were only allowed to describe the raw, unfiltered sensory data, the yellow color, the rigid length, the hexagonal shape. Actually, calling the object by its everyday name meant you weren't properly breaking the experience down into its basic structural parts. Section 2. The stream of consciousness. Functionalism emerges. But wait, structuralism might have been perfectly fine for mapping static little elements in a highly controlled, stuffy lab. But what about how the mind actually functions out in the messy real world? And this brilliantly illustrates our next big pivot. In 1890, William James dropped a monumental book called The Principles of Psychology, and he just completely shifted the paradigm. He argued that the mind absolutely is not a collection of tiny, isolated chemical elements. Instead, James cared about what the mind actually does. This approach became known as functionalism. His ideas were so profound and so timeless that modern summaries of his text are still widely studied everywhere today. He focused heavily on concepts like habit, attention, and willpower, basically how we use our mental toolkit to actively adapt to our environment. Let's put these two models side by side to really grasp this. Structuralism viewed the mind as a collection of static, discrete bricks that you just stack up. But functionalism, it saw the mind as a continuous, flowing stream. Actually, just pause and notice your own thoughts right now. They don't arrive in neat, isolated little boxes, do they? They shift, they blend, they focus and unfocus. It's a continuous stream of consciousness, which is actually a famous phrase that William James himself coined. Section 3. Secrets of the Unconscious. Freud, and Psychoanalysis. Okay, but hold on. Functionalism claims we use our flowing conscious mind to deliberately adapt to the world, right? Well, what if unseen forces are actually the ones steering the ship? Enter Sigmund Freud. He introduced psychoanalysis and radically suggested that human behavior isn't driven by rational, conscious thought at all. He famously used the metaphor of an iceberg. The conscious mind, the part of us that we're actually aware of, is just the tiny visible tip. Beneath those dark waters lies a massive, deeply submerged unconscious mind, absolutely packed with repressed desires, hidden conflicts, and powerful urges that are secretly dictating what we do. Freud basically said there's a three-way turf war happening inside your personality. First, you've got the id, which is all your primal, unconscious, give it to me now urges. Then there's the superego, your strict internalized moral compass that society handed down to you. And finally, the ego, which is basically the stressed out central executive just trying to balance those two extremes with the real world. Oh, and Freud also had this quirky yet massively influential insistence that almost all adult neuroses track directly back to childhood experiences. Now, right around the same time, another school of thought called behaviorism popped up to challenge Freud. Behaviorists wanted to make psychology purely objective. They said, let's ignore the hidden mind entirely and just look at observable stimulus and response, kind of like training animals with rewards. But notice something interesting here. Even though they are total opposites, both of these theories share a fundamentally dark flaw. They are both deeply deterministic. Whether you're a puppet to unconscious Freudian urges or just conditioned by behavioral rewards, both models essentially strip away your free will. You're just a product of forces outside your control. Section 4. The third force. Humanistic psychology. That philosophical bleakness, it sparked the next great rebellion. In the 1950s, a new wave of thinkers looked at the dehumanizing determinism of Freud and the behaviorists and said, no way. Humans are way more than just animals reacting to stimuli or helpless victims of the unconscious. This new rebellion was called humanistic psychology, or the third force, and it was a deeply, deeply optimistic approach. It emphasized personal agency, championed free will, and fundamentally viewed human beings as innately good. The humanists believed we all possess an inborn, natural drive to reach our highest possible potential, a concept they called self-actualization. One of the absolute pioneers of this movement was Carl Rogers. Just listen to this quote from him. "The only reality I can possibly know is the world as I perceive and experience it at this particular moment." It's powerful, isn't it? For Rogers and the humanists, taking cold lab measurements or endlessly digging up unconscious past traumas entirely missed the point. What mattered most was the subjective, personal, conscious experience of the individual right here, right now. Let's move on and see how this builds with another huge figure in humanism, Abraham Maslow. Maslow argued that personal growth actually follows a structured path. It's like climbing a ladder. First, you absolutely have to satisfy your foundational physiological needs, stuff like food and basic safety. Once you got that covered, you can move up to fulfill higher-order emotional needs, like a sense of belonging and self-esteem. And finally, at the very top, you achieve true self-actualization, unlocking these profound moments of deep fulfillment that he called peak experiences. Section 5. Debating human nature, applying the theories. So what does this all mean for you and me today? Let's bring these historical theories out of the past and see how they apply right now. Think back to Carl Rogers. He introduced a concept called congruence. He asked us to look at the gap between our actual self, which is how you currently view yourself, and your ideal self, the person you truly aspire to be. Rogers argued that psychological distress happens when there's a massive gap between these two selves. Think about your own life for a second. How wide is the gap between who you are right now and who you want to be? Humanistic therapy is all about closing that gap through self-acceptance. Now, it's important that we step back and impartially evaluate this movement. Humanism was an absolute game changer because it made therapy client-centered, focusing on holistic growth and empowering your free will. But critics definitely point out some valid limitations. For one, it kind of lacks rigorous, hard scientific measurement. It's also been heavily criticized for being ethnocentric, meaning it's pretty biased toward Western individualistic ideals. Plus, it really struggles to explain the darker, more cruel sides of human nature. And it's generally found to be less effective for treating severe, chronic psychological disorders when compared to more clinical approaches. So the crucial point here is that our modern understanding of the mind didn't just fall out of the sky as one perfect theory. It came from a series of brilliant, flawed, and totally interconnected rebellions. Structuralism gave us the very first scientific elements. Functionalism got the stream flowing. Psychoanalysis and behaviorism shined a light on powerful, unseen deterministic forces. And finally, humanism rebelled against all that to hand us back our free will and personal agency. Every single new idea rose from the ashes of the last one, constantly expanding the way we view human nature, which leaves us with a pretty fascinating thought to wrap up this explainer. If our entire history of psychology is really just a series of rebellions against what we thought we knew, what hidden forces in your own mind is the next generation of thinkers going to discover? Keep questioning, keep learning, and hey, thank you so much for exploring with us.